African Ascent, due to the kindness, the well-known kindness of Professor Lewis Gordon, one of the busiest professors on the planet, has agreed to share some of his precious time with us and have a conversation with me on my latest book, my 16th book, I think, called Self-Definition. Professor Lewis Gordon does not need any introduction. Like me, he's the author of many, many books, internationally known. He is currently the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut. Additionally, he is also an affiliate of a South African university. His books range all the way from Africana philosophy to Existence in Black. I cannot even list the numbers of books that he's written, but he's most particularly known for his work on Frantz Fanon, one of the greatest philosophers of the 21st century, and also Jean-Paul Sartre. Those who admire him as an interpreter of Sartre have a tendency not to realize that he's also an expert on Fanon. And those who admire him as the interpreter of Fanon have a tendency to think that he's one of the most prominent interpreters of Jean-Paul Sartre. This is not the first time that Professor Lewis Gordon is appearing in African Ascent. He has been quite generous with me. He has appeared 2-3 times. I consider him to be, although considerably younger than me, as one of my mentors, because age is not really a determining factor when we think about wisdom. He's wise, he's generous, he's brilliant. And I consider him one of the few people whom I consult when I do some of my foundational philosophical works. I could say considerably more, but it is really pointless to introduce somebody like Professor Lewis Gordon, who doesn't need any introduction because he's already well known. I can only say this before we begin the conversation. I thank you heartfully for making time to have a conversation with me about one of my favorite books called Self-Definition. Welcome to African Ascent.
Well, thank you, Toda, Tedros. And before I begin, I'll simply just say to the audience, I'll say Hotep, which is the way in the language of MeruNeter. In ancient Kemet, which many of you know as Egypt, is how you say hello. Shalom. For those who are celebrating Hanukkah, Chag Hanukkah Sameach. Ujambo to my East African folks who speak Swahili. And Tedros mentioned that I also teach in South Africa. I'll give a shout out to my colleagues at the University of South Africa, where I'm a visitor in the philosophy department, Rhodes University, where I'm the honorary professor in the Unit for the Humanities, and of course where Biko went to school, Fort Eyre in East London, where I'm also on faculty. But before any of that, my condolences, Tedros. It breaks my heart what's happening in Ethiopia. And anyone who's been watching you in this program know what your love for Ethiopia is. And so I know that this is breaking your heart. And so I send my condolences. And I send that also to the fellow Ethiopians who are viewing the show. You may not know, but I'm also of Ethiopian ancestry. Tedros knows I'm related to almost everybody, but the Jews I'm from were Jews who were from Jerusalem and Jews who were from Shannon, Ireland, but the ones in Jerusalem were connected to Jews who migrated there in the before the 19th century, from Ethiopia and from Egypt. And in the late 19th century, they migrated to Cuba and to Jamaica, and I'm material evidence of their migration. So that's how I'd simply like to say Hello to all. Oh, and one more thing. Munikisuk, if you're wondering what that means, that's what the Wampanoag people said when they greeted the pilgrims. Those are the indigenous people of what was colonized as New England. And Tedros was a very good friend of a very good friend of ours, Donna Mitchell, who was Wampanoag. And I miss her dearly. But as we know, the colonizers did not reciprocate the kindness of the indigenous people who welcomed them and contributed to their survival.
Wonderful. As always, Lewis, a wealth of information. This is the first time that I have come to learn that you are my brother, in the narrow sense, a fellow Ethiopian, but of course, my brother in the deeper sense, as a human being.
Well, given the argument of your book, Self-Definition, got my copy here. As you know, what we have to make humanity understand is we're all brothers, we're all sisters, and we're all beyond the designations of brothers and sisters. You know, one of the funny things I usually say when I talk about issues such as those in your book is, I usually ask my students, have you ever looked at a group of zebras, or zebras as the British would say? And they say, yeah. I said, well, don't they all look alike to you? And they say, yeah, because we just see zebras. But you know what zebras see? Every zebra or every zebra looks different. And that's because they're members of the same species. It's just like when you visit families. We always are wow, right? Wow, you all look so alike. And what do the family members always say? Hell no, I don't look like him or her. And well, whereas even identical twins, you can't tell us apart. And that's because when you're a member of the same family, you can see the differences. And so a lot of people have it turned upside down. They don't understand. It's precisely because humanity, all of us, are part of the same species, is why we can see our differences. And boy, if we couldn't, there are going to be some serious problems out there, including of incest. So it's a very good idea that members of a species can see the difference.
Challenging. I am already challenged, Lewis, in the following sense. It is true that differences are important. I agree with you. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there are substantive differences that matter and non-substantive differences by virtue of the fact that they are not substances that do not matter. What upsets me when I think about differences is that, take for example, the concept of race, add to it the concept of gender, add to it the concept of sex. It is my conviction that these outfits, as I like to call them, or appearances, as I try to dignify them more, just like appearances in the end are, their status is very questionable. They're simply facets of a deeper reality, of which there are facets that we cannot detect and see. Because we cannot detect the reality of which they are facets, we have a tendency to take these outfits, these facets, these non-substantive appearances as if they are substantive. It is when I see human beings doing this that I can't help but begin to think how mistaken human beings have become across a long range period of history. Because we have been socialized and conditioned to confuse facets with the substances of which they are facets by confusing the two. But facets, like outfits, are just that. They are not substantive. They are merely visible descriptions of what we cannot see. We cannot see, for example, the sameness of the human species that Diop and others have been working on for hundreds of years. Thanks to Diop, for example, we know that what we call the human species originated about 150,000 years ago in what is now referred to as Africa.
Actually, the information is now 300,000 years ago.
300,000 years, exactly.
The Homo sapiens.
Exactly.
But you know, Tedros, there are several things. The first thing is we need to get rid of this language of substance. Substance-based metaphysics has been a disaster. It's not only something from Aristotle, but it's something that has dominated a lot of Euromodern thought. And it is what also serves as a metaphysical underpinning of the philosophical anthropology of Euromodern colonialism and capitalism. Because you see, a substance properly is a thing, but that can be a being in itself. It is a thing that by virtue of itself relies on nothing else. And it is thus ontological. That is not human reality. Human reality is a reality that transcends being because human reality has relationships. It has meaning, it has symbols, it has signs, it has communicability. And because of that transcending of being, what human reality does is also bring the question of reality into being. So one of the critical issues, especially if we talk in metaphysical terms, is we need to reject the problematic consequence of substance-based metaphysics, among them, which is reductionism, the idea that there's the really real versus everything else. The problem with it is that meaning and, in reality, so to speak, I think it was best said by Kaiji Nishitani in Japan. And he says the problem with a lot of, he says Western, but I don't like to say the word Western because the Western is just an invention of the Mediterranean Renaissance. I mean, the truth of the matter is there really isn't a proper Western. It's actually an ideological trope. But what he does say is that Euromodern thought, premised upon a specific line of ancient thought, basically uses ontology to cover reality. Right? Now, when you say cover reality, what does that mean? Well, you see, it means however you try to put a fixture, which is, I think, what you were hinting at there. Part of human reality is the construction and the relationship of meaning that ultimately contextualizes being, but is not reduced to it. And this lack of reductionism is something crucial if we're dealing with not only emancipatory projects, but other projects, dignity, freedom, etc. So that first part is very crucial because if you think about what Euromodern capitalism has as its philosophical anthropology, it's the notion of an individual that can stand, and it's heavily gendered, fundamentally onto himself without any accountability to the rest of reality. Now, last I heard, there's a name for such a being. It's called God. So the hubris of Euromodern metaphysics and capitalism is to pit a category of people to stand before the rest of humanity as if they were gods. And this leads to a situation that they soon discover the moment anybody reflects on a human being. The paradox of a human being is we're born into profound fragility, vulnerability. We are a fundamentally dependent creature at birth. And if we do not enter the world of language, communication, meaning, science, etc., we know what that would mean. It would mean that although that person physically, that biological mass physically ages, the humanity would not have been awakened in that being. And so the fundamental relationality, the communicability, and the ability of human beings also to add to reality. I mean, that's amazing. You see, reductionistic metaphysics is like Popeye. Popeye says, I am what I am, that's all that I am. That's it. There's nowhere to go. Yet human reality can build worlds of meaning. We build different identities, creativity, etc. But the danger is that when we get into the substance stuff and the sameness stuff, we have to be a little careful, because you see, there's a paradox in every human being. We share a lot, but we also have a paradoxical unity in our differences. Now, you may say, what do I mean by that? Well, let me spell it out in a way that the audience might find useful. Think of ethics and think of love. The standard way we hear about ethics is you should only treat people well who are like you. You look for similarity, and that gives you the okay to be ethical. Similarly, the problematic view of love says you can only love people who are like you. So you look for your mirror, and then you narcissistically love a projection of yourself. Those two values are fundamentally colonial, because ultimately the first one fails to understand that ethical obligation begins actually from the realization that the other human being is a freedom, which means that other human being does not have to be like you. And similarly, radical love is not about trying to absorb another human being into your narcissistic projection of yourself. Love emerges when you can celebrate the freedom and dignity of another human being, which means that human being does not have to be reduced to you or me, but become a moment that you and I could live with, learn with, and love together. Now, that is the thing where we deal with a more complex understanding of normative life. And I see you talk about some of this in your book. And in my own writings, I call it the decolonization of normative life.
Yes. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with you. My argument about establishing the distinctions between what I call the facets and the real does not really require substance in order for the argument to work. What I try to do in the book is the following. I'm fascinated by how the Egyptians theorized, philosophized about the origin of the self. They concocted, the philosophers, that is, those opulent Egyptian philosophers, they concocted this concept of noon that they described as something that is like water, but is not exactly water. What it shares with water, physical water, is the dynamism, the flow, the perpetual movement. But it is not exactly water. Thales, for example, thought, after he spent quite a few years in Egypt and then went to Athens and found the first philosophy school, and along with the pre-Socratics, when they were busily thinking about the origins of the universe, Thales used the concept of water to establish that the universe originated in water. There is a resemblance between the Thalian idea of water and the Egyptian idea of noon, but they're also radically different because by noon they simply try to capture something infinite, I think.
Well, there's several things. Yeah. First, let me go a little backwards. First, for the audience, Egypt has only existed for 2,500 years because of Macedonian conquest. The Greek-speaking Macedonians there's a practice that Greeks and Romans have, or rather had, which is that wherever there is their prized place in an area that they colonize, they rename the region after that place. And so the Temple of Ptah, right, in Memphis, was referred to as Egyptos. And because of Memphis being a prized area, the Macedonian Greek-speaking peoples renamed the entire area Egypt.
Yes.
Before them, the Persians had come in, and the Persian, they basically, the Macedonians, took it from the Persians. Now, the Persian period, that means we're only going back about 2,700 years. However, the country, all right, that area was called Kemet, or Kemet, which means dark lands, and that's what the indigenous peoples called it. Kemet, or Kemet, goes back approximately, it goes back so far, maybe 35,000 years.
Indeed.
And it goes back so far that it was from the period in which there was no Sahara Desert, because it was just lush green lands and savanna, reaching all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And those many civilizations, with their accumulated knowledge, basically are the foundations. And for the audience, Upper Kemet is south, so that goes towards where you would have today the Sudan, through to Kenya, Somalia, and those areas. Lower Kemet was the Mediterranean, was to the north. So that already should make one understand that the people of Kemet, when they looked up, they looked south, because those were dark-skinned, Black people. They were Africans. It was very much an African civilization. The other thing to bear in mind is that there is no reason for the people of ancient Africa to have imagined that Africa ends at what would be the future Suez Canal. So ancient Africa reached as far as the Indus Valley, okay? Now, within that framework, this is one of the reasons why Africa is a MeruNeter term. MeruNeter is the language of the ancient people of Kemet. Afri means from, Ka means from the Ka, or womb. So Africa means from the womb. Now, if we can understand this, this gives us some insight in some of the ancient concepts. Because Nun, all right, it's often described as water, but it's greater than that. Because the whole point of Nun, all right, it's more akin, connected to the fluidity of existence.
Correct.
And you brought it up in your text when you talk about kippa, right? And that's even more complicated.
Yeah.
Because because I could read the language, and that's why in my books you see my own translations. Mm-hmm. And but the complicated thing, and that a lot of people don't realize, is that you notice that part of Ka, life force, womb, etc. Mm-hmm. This fluid, it's generative. Today we may say water, but water isn't really accurate.
Exactly.
Because it's generative.
Precisely.
The other thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about the mythopoetics of not something recent, but something, as I just hinted at, that's thousands of years old. Not like, and here's how, for the audience to bear in mind, right? Just for them to bear this in mind. It means we're talking about a country so old that it was around when there were no white people. And when I say white people, I'm using it in a morphological term. In other words, white people, as we know white people, is only about 500 years old. But morphological white people, light people, were simply, for reasons of agriculture and vitamin D insufficiency, Africans who lightened up when they were in parts of West Asia and Europe. So, and that phenomenon only emerged as genetics and biomedical research are demonstrating approximately, before they said 8,000 years ago, now it turns out to be 6. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about Kemet, which goes back maybe 30,000 years, that's a whole lot of history without any morphological white people around. Now, the interesting thing to bear in mind is that while these different ways of looking at reality were being formed, okay, the people, the morphologically lighter people, they didn't come in until the dynastic periods already emerge. And so when most people are studying what they call Egypt, they usually, the study is broken up into three periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. Okay? The New Kingdom is where you have pretty much Persian and Macedonian elements creating Egypt. But the longer period of its history is the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom is only being marked because of the dynasties. There's an older period than that. And with that older period, a lot of the conceptual framework was devised by women. So for instance, the earliest mathematicians, the earliest scientists, the philosophical knowledge, a lot of those were women, not only Pressahed, whom you talk about, but we could also, believe it or not, and again, I could give a long list, but I'll give one because it'll connect into what you're saying about Nu. Because everybody knows her name, Nefertiti. Now, when people think of Nefertiti, because they think of the meaning of her name, Nefer, which means beauty, they think of her simply as a beautiful woman. But this is probably the first time you're hearing of Nefertiti as a philosopher. Well, she was a philosopher. She and her husband Akhenaten devised the emanation theory of reality. And the emanation theory of reality basically argues that what reality produces is a manifestation that we have as appearance. As a consequence, that which creates reality itself doesn't appear.
Yes.
This is their argument for the indivisibility of God. That ultimately, you see what I'm saying? That God cannot be personified. God has an impact on reality. Indeed. And you could see how this emanation theory and this invisibility, this generative concept connects to Nu. Okay? And there's a lot more to be said there, but this is the core of what later became monotheism. And it's one of the reasons why Judaism, its foundation, is East African, and it comes out of that tradition. But that would be, we could have an entire session of the ancient foundations of Judaism. But for now, the point about Nu is crucial, because the point about existence is that people often, because of the limitations of the English language, confuse existence and being, and they're not the same thing. Existence, because it stands out, is always other than being. Nu cannot be being because it would be a subset.
Yes. Because
it generates that being is an outcome of Nu rather than a cause. And that gives one a very important sense of the importance of that concept. And of course, there are other complicated things because of the personification at the symbolic level. But again, ancient people are often misread because of this abomination in Euro-modern thought called primitivism. Primitivism basically imputes to the people of the distant past a form of stupidity and naivety. But the people of the past were very aware of what the mythic language is and how it relates to their different forms of scientific and philosophical language. So if you think about, say, in MeruNeter, you have Nu, you have Mai, right? And my, right, which is linked into ability, power, and life. You put a T on it, and you have Ma'at, which is personified in a goddess. But Ma'at, which is far more complex than the reductionistic concepts of like justice, the way people think of justice today, Ma'at points out that justice is a smaller subset, that you can have certain balances and right, but if you do not have the larger constellation of life and health, then you just have a miserable justice. And why this is really crucial in order to understand some of these concepts from antiquity is precisely because, you see, breath, health, a lot of these other concepts are more relational. If you have things organized, and this is insightful because you bring this up in your book, what they understood is that if you get into this epic battle of order versus chaos, if you tried to get order to win, you would have destroyed the vibrancy of reality. So Nun, which later on translate, as you point out, through Atum and through other areas,
that's
right, are crucial for us to have this understanding of the relationality of reality. And if we think through some of these concepts, for instance, if you think through Rex or Reka, right, that's a word that's foundational, leads all the way up to words like regulate, religion, a lot of these concepts.
Yeah.
But the ancient Reket were female. They were not anatomically exclusively female, but they were what majority of them were anatomically female, were people who studied reality and nature. And these were the early scientists. And the reason this is important, of course, is because these are terms that really connect through, all the way through, across the Mediterranean, across the Indian Ocean, and many other areas, to how we can understand certain organizational concepts. In the Northern Europe here, lok became the concept of log and logos. But if we look in the South, rek, rex, or rex, which is often the Romans Romanized it into a patriarchal term for king. But rex, like my middle name is Ricardo, it's from rex. It actually come from the community of female scientists. And it makes sense because a lot of what the survival of ancient communities depended upon was a kind of knowledge of understanding how the principles of how things work. But there are other kinds of knowledge. I often say to my students, how many words can you use for knowledge in the English language? I mean, for wisdom. And they look at me like, wisdom? But we're talking about a language with more than 36 words to talk about kinds of wisdom. And even the term like, so you have rex, but you also have sa and say. But say, which relates to Sabaeat, when Grecoized, became Safed and became Sophia, which, as we know, is the word for wisdom. And so there's a lot that needs to be understood if we interrogate this deeper understanding of not only how humanity could think creatively, but how to understand it. We can live outside of these horrible boxes, which is what you're hinting at.
Yes.
Boxes that try to put Nun into the box, exactly, rather than to understand that a box is just a limited subset of reality.
I am incredibly grateful, as always, for the way you fleshed out the historical grounding of this ancient mythical concept of Nun.
Just to interrupt you for a second, because I think the audience might dig it. The audience might dig it. Nun is also the foundational word because one of the languages that emanated out of MeruNeter is Hebrew.
Mhm.
Now, because of racist linguistics, it's I said there's a desire to make it an exclusively West Asian language. But I just pointed out that ancient Africa reached into what's called West Asia,
Indeed.
so in the land of Canaan. But that means the mythopoetics continued. Well, Nu became the term for Noah, which became Noah. And everybody knows the Noah myth is about water.
Indeed.
Anyway, just that
Yeah.
is a little thought for the audience.
And it's remarkable. I'm so grateful that we're having this rich conversation. Now, Lois, let me throw another hypothesis at you, and take your time and be critical, as critical as you want. I love that. It is this. What this mythical concept of noon did for me when I wrote self-definition is that it empowered me to also think about the origin of race and gender and sex in the following way. Noon, this water-like but not exactly water, which you described as generative, gave me an insight to think about how the first human cell originated. It came out of Noon. Hear me out carefully so that it can be critical. But it came out formlessly. There is no form to this cell. It is something that began, a beginning that began itself. And then we learn all of a sudden that this cell, this formless cell, is given rigid designations, some of which are sexual, some of which are gendered. Race, of course, at this stage is absent. Let me just stick to gender and sex. This cell is just impregnated with possibilities. That's all we know. It's only when Atum, the first Egyptian god, by his own self-description, reports that he came out of Noon, then suddenly Atum is given a masculine form, Lois. But this original self, I'm willing to debate you on this, did not have any rigid designations. It was formless. It could be anything. But then it's complicated by the fact that Atum is given to global literature now as a masculine Kemetian god. Whereas it seems to be the case that prior to him giving itself, I use my terms carefully, not itself or they, this rigid masculinity, all that there was a cell. And this cell I am referring to as impregnated with possibilities, or metaphorically speaking, is something like infinite consciousness. This is where I began, Lois. And then, as I researched further, and then began reading Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu, who came considerably later. By then, of course, Kemetian ideas have become universalized. I am no historian. I can't speak with historical details, but it is reasonable to assume that Chuang Tzu and Lao Tzu, who came considerably later, could not have possibly originated this idea of infiniteness, this idea of boundaries that Chuang Tzu in particular is critiquing. When he's thinking about the real, Chuang Tzu describes this as something that is not bounded by knowledge, that is not confined, that is open-ended, that could be anything, which reminded me in a remarkable way of this idea of infinity that I located in the very concept of Nun itself. I'll stop here so that he can respond.
Well, sure. I mean, well, there are several things. Do bear in mind that a variety of languages in the Indus Valley that go back really, I mean, several thousand years. And part of this is connected to, I mean, this would take some time, but one problem is the way we think of the organization of knowledge and thinking today is premised upon a very colonial understanding of the university and how knowledge is produced. So it's based on Bologna, Italy. It's only going back around 1100 years. But in the ancient worlds, and I use that in plural, there were many learning communities, many communities that were devoting time to figure out reality, and certain concepts did emerge among them. And so, for instance, if one were to deal with Sanskrit, or if one would find the concept of shunyata. And shunyata, which is often translated as radical emptiness. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, if you're radically empty, you're already getting into that question of infinity that you're talking about.
Exactly.
And you could find that also, so there are ways in which they are connected there. So it wouldn't be, it's not necessarily that different groups couldn't think of certain concepts, because the way I look at it, there's so many cool ideas that we find out people think of over and over again. And so by the time we find somebody we think is the first, there may have been somebody who did it 1,000 years earlier. It's all we're encountering is those who are recorded first, but it's not necessarily the first to do it. But if we were to go back to Nun, it's rather interesting. I was thinking about your analysis of why was Atum put in the at least the manifestation of anatomical maleness.
Yes.
Because I don't want to say man or masculine.
No.
Because it means something different. Well, if we look at the logic, I think a clue is in the story of Geb and Nut. Mm. Because, and this is a very important story, because for the viewers who are not familiar with the story, Geb is basically male, but the earth. Nut is the sky and is female.
Yes.
Now, what's crucial here is that for many ancient peoples, the sky was looked at the way you look at water. Water falls from it. It's blue. It basically, it's a mirror of the ocean. So if one is going to start with fluid, for the ancient East African peoples, the sky was feminine. You see? Now, why is this important? Because if we think of the generative nature of Nun, and we think of the generative nature of Nut, you see how similar the names are?
Yeah, indeed. Exactly.
So that meant within, and by the way, there were many genders and sexuality in ancient East Africa.
Yes.
But because these are cosmogenic myths, no matter what your sexualities are, the cosmogenic myths within the framework of mammals requires a male and a female of some kind, whether not for the male to identify as a male or the female to identify as a female, just simply for the gonads to exist. And so already there's an initial movement from Nun, right, to Atum that creates now this question of a duplication, because all myth repeats. And so the repetition of Nun to Atum becomes Geb to Nut. But here's the crucial thing, and this is crucial. By the time you have Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking colonization, those are fundamentally patriarchal society, not simply patrilineal. Patrilineal and patriarchal are not the same thing. You see, patriarchal is where you locate legitimacy and power. Patrilineal just means whether you say, you're connected to your father's family or not. You see, just like there's societies that are matrilineal, but patriarchal. And then there are some societies that are patrilineal, but matriarchal. So why this is an important distinction is because the patriarchal societies adopted this myth, but they could not stomach the idea of a woman being on top, because in the myth, she mounts the earth, and that leads to fertility and the ongoing generation of other gods and eventually humanity. They could not tolerate a woman on top. So they flipped it and feminized Geb into the name Gaia.
Yes.
You could see the obvious connection. And they changed Nu or Nut, which is actually, it's very complicated because the consonants are tricky. So the way it would pronounce is more like and they change it to Usia. So you have now Gaia and Usia. What's Usia? Sky. And sky becomes masculine. The male mounts the female and produces the gods. They retold the ancient African myth, and you could see it to the letter. When I read the Theognis, one of my degrees is in classics, just for the audience to know. It's not, the reason I say it's because there's a certain point when, because I work in many areas of philosophy, people are wondering, where does this guy get time for all this stuff? But my initial training was in philosophy, politics, physics, biology, and classics. And basically, if you read the Theognis by Hesiod, you can map on which ancient Kemetan gods and goddesses, and there were also some who were gender neutral, and that's a more complicated issue, into those texts, right? So once we disaggregate it from patriarchy, which puts the man on top, because within their framework, the woman can be on top, because as you pointed out in your book, we're talking about a society where women not only owned property, had rights, they selected their partners. This was a society that was very different from the society in the Peloponnesus or in places like, the boot of Italy, stuff like that. And within that framework then, right, what one has now is a story about generation, about procreation.
I like that term very much.
But the crucial part is that it's not a story, as you rightly point out, about patriarchy. Okay? In other words, whoever is on top isn't better. Whoever's on bottom isn't less. It's just that, and it's hard for people to imagine today because people today are stuck with Mother Earth. But for many ancient peoples, it was Father Earth and Mother Sky. You see? And when you think about that, that's a very different way, because there were all kinds of things linked to sky, such as Isis is linked to fluids, etc. We have a limited time, but in my book, Fear of Black Consciousness,
we have to do part 2, Louis.
Yeah, I have a detailed analysis of Jewish myths and East African myths in the movie The Black Panther to explain the mythopoetics there. But if people could understand these myths, a lot of these stories would make more sense.
Well, we only have 10 minutes left. As I told my audience, inviting Louis is not only to become philosophically tantalized, but also to be historically informed. His range of knowledge, I need not repeat this, the audience witnessed it, is simply extraordinary. And it is reliable. I could use it. I could do things with it. So I can only say to Louis how grateful I am to you for enriching self-definition, which, as you know, is written through the resources of the analytic tradition. But in your hands, you gave it a richness, a significance that has encouraged me to consider doing a companion to it, very much like what Fanon did, which is to do field work and look for remnants of this mythic concept in prevailing African states and African regimes. I hope I will live long enough to consider producing an empirical work that will be informed by the history, the kind of history that he shared with us. This is not the first time that I have said to Lewis how extraordinary the episodes that I have done with him are. I know he's so busy, but I will not rest until after I do part 2 to this interview that just began, in which this time I will be interviewing Lewis as opposed to co-interviewing each other. But I must say to Lewis, thanks for the attention and respect that he gave to self-definition. He made me like my book, Lewis.
I'm glad to hear, Tedros. And also, one of the reasons I'm meeting in this room, sometimes I meet in the library, but I'm very proud of this big painting in back of me. Yes, it symbolizes a lot of what African Ascent is about. That was a painting done by Sula Gordon. She's an artist. And, you know, her work is all around the place. Actually, the house has quite a few artists. And, but at some point we could talk about art. But there's one thing I'd like to, since we have 10 minutes, just briefly ask you. One thing, it struck me, the discussion of Islam in the text. And the, some of the issues that you're addressing, there's a wonderful discussion by Ali Shariati in Man and Islam. And I think for particularly American audiences or those who are not Muslim, it's a very good idea for them to know not only the distinctions between Sunni and Shia, and also the uniqueness of African Islam, particularly among Sufism. But one of the things that Shariati brings up that's very crucial, and it's related to an issue that's brought up in Jewish studies as well. What many who read the Torah, or even those who read the Bible, the Christian ones, and where they have the Old Testament, don't realize is that the first book of Genesis and the second books were written not only by different people, but they contradict. And that's because the initial story of Genesis, which is basically a retelling of the story of Nun, which was what we were talking about, and a retelling of Atum and the whole thing, is that woman and man, male and female, were created at the same time. Yeah, there was no, right? But then a form of conservatism subsequently happened among the ancient writers. And because remember, they're coming out of East African society, which had a very different view of female and male roles. Yeah. And as they began to adopt more into a more Western Asiatic society, and a lot of Asian societies are particularly patriarchal, a retelling emerged in which the first wife, Lilith of Adam, had to be expelled, you know, and that from his supposed, from a limb, but supposedly a rib, of Eve was created, or Chava. And the argument there was to put in her structure that she comes out of the male and is just subordinate to him. Well, Shariati pointed out that it's a profound mistranslation, particularly of the Arabic in the Quran, and that the central thesis in the Quran is that not only were male and female created out of clay or mud, and in fact, the name for human in Hebrew is Adamah, which means red clay or mud. But that to create them, God or Allah blew his breath into them. Now, why that is crucial, you see, it goes back to that point about Maya and Mayat.
Yes.
Also to breath and life. But this is no regular life. This is God's life blown into you. Mm-hmm. And it's crucial because in the Quran, humanity is actually above the angels. Because you see, God didn't breathe life directly into the angels. And that's why, according to Shariati's analysis, humanity has a gift that's shared with God, which is the gift of language, words, and naming. Angels don't name anything. human beings do, which is connected to our point. You see? And this extraordinary power to produce meaning, names, designation. This is equally shared by females and males. So Shariati goes to great extent to point out that the subordination of women in Islam is not, he argues, properly Islamic. It's connected to different historical political forces. And if one goes and look at the history of Islam, one would see this all over the place. And we'd have to have another conversation on this, because one of the things I'd love to interrogate you on in your book is the use of the word modern.
Yes.
Because you see, Islam was modern in those times because the early Islam afforded more rights for women than Christianity did, which was vehemently misogynistic religion. You see, a lot of people don't realize this aspect. And why this is crucial is Islam, just as with Christianity and Judaism, was constantly shifting as it went back to its roots. So for instance, Middle Eastern Muslims are often shocked when they're in West Africa meeting Muslims. Because in the Middle East, I hate to say Middle East, West Asia, okay?
West Asia, yes.
The certain roles, such as, for instance, who governs the marketplace, those are masculine in West Asia. But in Africa, everybody knows this. Who governs the marketplace across Africa or the Caribbean, which is a very African-oriented place? Everywhere there is African-oriented civilization, women dominate markets. And markets are connected to places of measurement, which goes all the way back to that ancient community of women I call the Reket. And this is crucial. There are lots of things about measurement, numbers that are connected with women, but the crucial element here was that the Middle Eastern Muslims would be outraged. What are these women doing? But these women are being African. They create, in other words, the Islam they practice is African Islam. You see what I'm saying? And similarly, for a long time, early Christianity was very African. But in the rise of Islam, the separation from African Islam to Northern European, African Christianity to Northern European Christianity led to a very different kind of Christianity, okay? But that would require another talk. But the main thing, when we meet again, I would love to talk about, because this is crucial. This is linked to the concept of the modern. Because Christianity and Islam are eschatological. And for the viewers, what that means is they are religions that deal with a notion of redemption that will unfold in history, either the coming back of Jesus, whatever it may be, the afterlife, all that stuff. But this teleology, this view that there is an actual conclusion going of history, raises the question of who belongs to the conclusion. And that's how you read the present. And those who belong, in Latin, the term is modus, which means are of the present. And so to be modern is to belong to the present by virtue of being connected to the future. And so that relates a lot to your question, because what race in its transition to racism does is to have a designated group of people who supposedly do not belong to the future.
I have to make time because I know you're extremely busy, so that we can do an entire episode on modernity and the origin of race. I think that would be a very substantive episode that we could do. And I'll be shortly emailing you to see when you will be available, so that we can do it when the momentum is on.
That would be wonderful. And also for the audience, it would be wonderful because they hear this a lot, terms like constructions and definitions, etc.
Yes.
It would be important for us to also just have a conversation on what you mean by the self and self-definition, because there's ambiguity when we say self-definition.
Yes.
And it would be great for the audience to know what you mean and how you're using it and why you use it that way.
Okay, That would be fantastic. That's in fact an area that I think could be done in one entire episode. As you know, about 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Self-Construction, again within the analytic tradition, in which I distinguished what I called modeling, imitation, and constructing values. And then 10 years later, after I read Judith Butler very carefully, and of course Foucault before her, it occurred to me that self-construction and self-definition are intimately interrelated, and in that the distinctions that are established in self-construction between imitation, modeling, and construction equipped me, empowered me to use the idea of noon and that unneeded masculinizing of that first cell that emerged out of noon, that blocked the possibility of that cell to construct itself, so that in the course of time it could construct values, to use your term, that enable it to choose freely without getting dominated. And so it occurred to me 15 years later that self-definition and self-construction are intimately related, and in that the self-defining human being does not imitate, although imitation is necessary as an initial step, does not necessarily model one's life after reviewed beings, whoever these beings are, actors, performers, philosophers themselves, so forth and so on. But that defines possibilities of existence for itself as a free being. This is how I relate to these two books, and I would like to do an episode on that and relate it to the origin of modernity and the way modernity blocked this infiniteness that was present in noon by rigidly defining the self as either male, female, black, white, green, and the rest. I attribute this this blocking of the self to define itself to what I call the modern gaze.
Well, that would be wonderful, Tedros. One thing I'd say very quickly too is, I studied philosophy with, I was fortunate, I got to study with some people who exemplified a very profound genealogy. I studied with, in terms of analytical philosophy, I studied with Ruth Barkett Marcus, and, people who like, John Smith, his advisor was Bertrand Russell, Sidney Hook, and people such as Gadamer, and studied phenomenology with Maurice Nathanson, whose advisor was Alfred Schutz, and that's a direct line to Husserl and Brentano, or with Sean Copeland, and she was connected to the womanist theology movement, etc. Now, why I bring this genealogy up is I've noticed recently when some people write on me, they almost want to protect themselves by the way they bring up analytical philosophy, because they want, and they don't realize I know it through and through. My critique of analytical philosophy is that it ceases to be philosophy. It has become a commodified conceptual analysis simply for career movement. The story you just related is of a person trained under the rubric of philosophy, actually not to be a philosopher, and realizing that when you think philosophically, you have to shed the clothes of analytical philosophy. And what I mean by that is that it's just a subset. Philosophy is way broader than what Eurocontinentalists, analytical people, pragmatists, all these designations, we're talking about boxing and names.
Yes.
A lot of them, the moment anybody who is moved by wonder, by philosophy, begins to start first at the philosophical camp into which they're defined, all the problems you described about racism and sexism follow.
Yes.
It closes the mind. And indeed, it's no accident that there was a profound level of complicity of analytical philosophy and retrograde movements and policies of racism in the 20th century.
No question.
Because it's not structurally designed to be radically critical of its own system.
Indeed.
And among the Eurocontinentalists, as much as they may be critical of the analytical people, the problem is deep down, they start with the presupposition that thought itself began in Europe, which is false. And so the Eurocentrism of continental philosophy needs to be rejected as well. What we need is truth. And truth we have to understand, right, doesn't have to negotiate with us. We need to figure out our relationship with reality, and we need to deal with it. And it means sometimes philosophy offers an answer, but other times it doesn't. And this is one of the reasons why the best minds are people who are also hit with a wonderful dose of humility, because it means they understand they can always learn something from someone else.
Well, with that, I will have to sadly announce that the episode will come to an end when it had just begun. And so we'll have to return to this at an appropriate time and retrace and redo what we began doing today. Today's episode was historically rich, and the audience must be truly mesmerized by the depth and breadth of the knowledge that Professor Luz Gordon has shared with us. And when we do part 2, as he humbly suggested, we're going to get into defining what self-definition is, what self-construction is, what race is, what racisms are, and how these terms came into being. Before we part company, Lewis, it's my reading of Foucault and Judith Butler, who never mentioned anything non-European, who never gazed back to look at noon, and that inspired me to retrace what they thought originated in the West. This is particularly the case with Judith Butler and also with Foucault, because I traced it and found out that the notion of infiniteness and these maximal possibilities for the self are already buried in this mytho concept of noon that I and you have been talking about tonight.
Well, Foucault is dead. Judith is alive. And Judith Butler, I could say that because we consider ourselves siblings, because we had the same advisor, Judith 10 years earlier. I saw Judith now identifies as they, that's why I didn't use the term she. But Judith is reading this material now. Judith, they've been writing me and we've corresponded. And one of the things I love about Judith, which connects to her argument, is Judith explores what happens when you're willing to let go of problematic attachments.
Remarkable, remarkable. I know you're a good friend of Judith. I have never met them, but I have studied their work very carefully. And then it inspired me to humbly say, to write a corrective to that genealogy, because the ancient concept of noon is nowhere present in the gazes of Foucault and Butler. And once I equipped myself with that, I couldn't stop dancing, Lois. I knew that I was onto something, and you have helped me today to shape it and present it in a remarkable way. I have to say to you, I'm grateful for the third time.
Well, thank you again for inviting me to be on the show. And I'm glad if anything I had to say is of use, not only to you, but also to the audience, whom I take it since we're signing off. I should just simply say, I wish you all safety and health. There's now the Omicron virus, novel coronavirus. But despite how difficult the times are, really do find moments of joy. It'll remind you of your humanity.
Thank you, Louis. This has been your host, Theodros Kiros for African Ascent, interviewing Professor Luz Gordon.